Sorry, can I be heard? I don't know if I'm audible. Sorry, I don't know if I'm audible. Can anyone confirm to me that I'm being heard? So I need to know that before. Okay, yeah. All right. So let me post the motion reading the text, please. Please indicate you're speaking other. Every other team. I think I've seen that TO has done that, OG as well. So every other team in the room, please do that. All right, very much. Thank you very much. So yeah, let's go ahead and do this. Prime Minister, please, you have the floor.
Sorry, can you hear me clearly?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. So just give me a second. So I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. So in this debate, there are two things that I need to prove to you, right? In this debate, I need to prove to you that when Western countries are actively supporting military-industrial complexes, right, there are two conclusions. One, that it is the best mechanism for member states to sustain their military systems. So instead of them spending so much money out of tax, they can economically sustain themselves through a military-industrial complex. Secondly, it allows the state to invest in innovative systems of military systems and to be competitively viable in growing their military infrastructure incentivized by the military industrial complex. This means, in simple terms, that the state itself is incentivizing a private market systems for the military. So it means that we have defense, we have military companies such as Lockheed Martin in the United States of America that finances the US government and lobbies the US government and supports the US government's military system. The metric of support is in three folds, right? One, we support something within this context because it is extremely necessary. Secondly, it is extremely urgent to sustain the military infrastructure for the long term. And thirdly, we decrease spending by the government in buying in buying weapons and just privately investing in the industrial complex. What does it look like? It is a network of individuals and institutions in the production of military weapons and military technologies. Countries such as the United States of America then make 398 billions in selling their weapons to other countries. For instance, they're selling their weapons to Ukraine to necessarily fight wars. Russia does the same thing when it sells its military equipment to countries like Iran to essentially make and strengthen their military industrial complexes. What this means is that when state actors such as the United States of America and Russia, after the post-Cold War era, normalizes this behavior, it necessitates Western countries to opt in. This opt-in mechanism is very necessary because if these Western countries cannot do that, it means one, they're going to essentially rely on their military systems without having private individual military firms. But secondly, it means that being forced to stay relevant without an existing metric of sustaining their military infrastructure. This debate then is about sustaining the military infrastructure, whether the government is ready to support the investment and the growth of the private military infrastructure through the industrial complex, or it is necessarily going to ignore this and regret investment in this. I think the context of the debate is in Western countries, and essentially then we need to engage why necessarily this is important for them. I think the ultimate purpose is very clear in this debate, right? They need to marshal political support for continued and increased military spending by the national government. The national government doesn't need to tax people to essentially maintain their military infrastructure. It doesn't need necessarily to spend so much money, billions and billions of money from the people's taxes and people feeling they're vulnerable, because the counterfactual is the United States of America utilizing the annual budgetary proposal and spending it in the military system. Why is that counterfactual very harmful? I think first what it necessarily does is it forces you to spend money from taxpayers and you sustaining the military system. But secondly, it is not sustainable in the long term. Because for instance, if World War III happens, Western countries will be forced to fight. To that extent, it means they're going to force people's money and eat the citizens' money to essentially fund the military system. Why is it immoral to essentially spend money from the citizens in maintaining your military infrastructure? First, people will be forced essentially to pay more taxes because the military system is very expensive. But secondly, governments have not been the best financial actors themselves to essentially maintain military infrastructure, meaning that they need private individual firms, one, to develop the expertise that they need, but secondly, they need this technical industrial complex to have so much money. So meaning that, again, if Boeing is building the military infrastructure as a private company, it means Boeing, one, has the technical expertise, secondly, technological expertise, but thirdly, it is utilizing its money through a public-private relationship with the government. Why is this extremely sustainable? One, those companies have so much money. But secondly, what those companies are looking for is to stay relevant within the market system itself. So they're going to incentivize themselves with the government, and the government is going to sponsor them really well. Why is this, in the best case scenario, very sustainable for the Western countries themselves? I think first, the Western countries are not going to be aggressive in standing alone, because the counterfactual is the governments are going to just spend taxpayers' money because it's necessary to invest into military infrastructure. But again, the reason why it is very necessary for them to essentially sustain itself through this private-public relationship in building an industrial complex is, one, to stay ready and stay relevant, because they are always vulnerable to attack. I think the current systems of economic recession, COVID-19, arms race, is forcing countries to stay relevant. To that extent, it means that when you're not prepared, then you're going to be attacked, and that essentially will have violated the contractual moral obligation to your citizens. Any POI? POI from COO. Okay, so I'm going to go on. So why essentially is this very important, right? So the reason why this is important is you want to avoid the United States of America, for instance, monopolizing the industrial complex. Because if the United States of America is going to monopolize the global military complex, one, it is highly likely the United States of America is going to be selfish. Meaning that then, if they're selfish in selling military weapons to you as a state actor, it means there is a moral obligation of your state actor to develop yourself faster. So, for example, then it's like if the US starts adopting Bitcoin and essentially becomes the greatest country that develops the Bitcoin infrastructure, then you as a Western country, you're being forced by the circumstances because it is necessary for you. But secondly, you cannot be spending your own money, right? Because when private defense military systems start growing and polarizing the global market system, it means two things. One, you'll never have any form of opt-in mechanism within the market system. Secondly, the United States of America is going to create a barrier to entry. That barrier to entry is very harmful for two reasons. One, no one is you're not going to be efficient, right? Because listen, market systems, defense systems for these weapons, you need to be very efficient and very competitive. It's like how Apple and Samsung are competing. You need to be competing. But secondly, when you're too late, and where they're late again, which is the worst case scenario, it means two things. One, government will only spend money without any form of return on investment. But secondly, there'll be no opt-in mechanism for the government itself to contractually to build this sort of contractual efficiency. Why is this very problematic? I think for two reasons. One, you necessarily end up being alone without any form of financial model to finance your military infrastructure. But secondly, then you won't have efficient mechanisms to fight back. Because at the end of the day, it's about one, fighting back, but secondly, sustaining your military infrastructure. And that is the parameters of the debate. Debate is not about anything else except sustaining the military infrastructure and the best decision for the government to sustain its military infrastructure by building this military industrial complex or using its own money in financing the military infrastructure. That is my case.
We thank the speaker for their speech. We'd now like to invite the leader of opposition to start the debate for their side. I'll set up the timer, so you can use that time to test your mic if you're audible. Leader of opposition.
Thank you, Chair. So, wow. I hope I'm audible. And if anyone has a POI, I personally prefer if you just unmute and say POI, and then like I'm going to take you. Because if you just write it in the text space, I might not like pass it because I would be concentrating on like the timer. So with that said and done, I begin in 3, 2, and 1. The reason why we are having this debate today is to interrogate why, as an actor, Western countries, all the impacts and all the analysis that we make in this debate must be in the best interest of these Western countries. Why we have this debate is to interrogate, are we supposed to actively make these Western countries support military industrial complex, but on the other hand, op sides are supposed to say, well, we are not going to support this. Whatever we get from the Prime Minister is one, Prime Minister is trying to impose a burden on us to defend government's funding to military and not to private firms doing so. And this debate is not about that. You're making this debate complicated. But even if we are supposed to like kind of interrogate your worst case scenario, this is what Prime Minister's case is. That one, the counterfactual is that one, it is immoral to fund military industrial complexes using taxpayers' money, so we are supposed to shift it from privates. Panel, this is not the debate, but even if this is the debate, you need to understand this. Panel, weapon production for most of these Western countries has actually shifted. From some of them, very few have shifted from actually public to private owned companies. You take an example of United States, which is like one of the only one which has only shifted from like public to private. Other countries, most especially in Europe, and like a good example is like France, most of them have still maintained the status quo, which is let the public actually fund this particular kind of like a military industrial complex. But even if you say it is immoral, one, it is not immoral because the state social contract theory literally demands that it is the government which is supposed to provide security for its own people. At a point in time, you decide, or Prime Minister's side decides, okay, let this kind of security monopoly shift from public to actually private. What you're trying to do is that you're removing the social contract theory from government's actually mandate to the private. Why this is detrimental in the long term is that, panel, you do not want a kind of scenario whereby you have private entities producing a lot of weapons and from secret agencies to a point in time that when the government does not actually decide to honor their lobbying or actually pass their policies, what you find is that they now act as a threat to government. Government needs to have this kind of natural monopoly over the military spending or even military weapon productions and military industrial complex so that they can maintain and uphold the supremacy of the constitution. At a point in time that anyone or any person is threatening the supremacy of these Western countries, the government is supposed to act in the best interest of the constitution and whatever they had in the ruling party's manifesto, and not that the private company, because it has now funded the research and even the scientists have now a monopoly kind of control in that status quo. Why this is detrimental in the long run for Prime Minister's case is that one, if you decide to shift this from private company to private companies, is that the scientists and even the research grants and even most of the universities are going to be now funded by the private institutions to actually have the scientists and researchers and lecturers now researching on like how is this weapon or how is this chemical actually going to be used. That is detrimental. To our case in the substantial, we tell you of what this debate is about, panel. The best interest of Western countries, one, is to assess the situation going on in the status quo. That at a point in time, you are having people shifting out of their allegiance to the United States and Washington and actually shifting to China. You do not want the Western countries to be viewed as a threat in society. What you want is that their international image is supposed to be viewed as something that is upholding democracy and stating to that. You do not want them to actually promote policies that might be in their country's worst interest. For example, when you actually say that you're actively supporting military-industrial complex, it looks like participating in the nuclear arms race, and it is not clear from government side why we as a Western country is supposed to do this, yet we are actually incentivizing Iran to actually sign the deal to sign out of the nuclear weapon race, and we are even trying to actually make North Korea, we're actually putting sanctions because North Korea is using the nuclear weapons. So that is going to be hypocrisy on your side of the house. Secondly, you need to interrogate the fact that in the normal status quo, most of the Western countries are going to use the national government fund, especially from the treasury, to historically actually, because even historically we've seen, they actually fund weapon production. They're going to fund particular kind of companies, your POI.
Okay, so at a point in time where peace fails and people like Kim Jong-un don't want to listen to what US has to say, are we going to just let Kim Jong-un bomb every other people as we sit down and don't have weapons to match his energy?
I've understood your POI. Let me finish my substantial and then engage on that exemption panel. Panel, we tell you that at a point in time where national government is actually going to spend a lot of money for ordering goods and services for the military. When we take a historical kind of case study whereby orders for goods and services kind of increased from 27 billion USSD to 42.3 billion during the Cold War, and also the total budget for the fiscal year of the military industrial service increased to 79.88 billion, which was more than compared to what the economy was actually getting in profit during the Vietnam War panel. We tell you that it is in the incentive of Western countries to actually actively not support this particular kind of thing. On our counterfactual panel, the military is not actually dying. These Western countries are not going to actually lag in development because what you do, you have people actually increasing their technology and nuclear weapons. They do that in status quo, but they do not actively do that. Actively means that you will have to now recruit people to start working in all this. You will actively go and mine for these particular products that are going to be used and all that, meaning that most of your policies, political policies, are going to be put or are going to actually be rotating around this military base. The kind of thing that you get from James's POI panel is a very kind of exemption, which on a spectrum is not something that is actually going to grow or going to be, they're trying to exaggerate it. Panel, you need to understand that at a point in time where North Korea is investing in nuclear weapons, United States and these Western countries also have their nuclear weapons. But unless they are threatened or their democracy is threatened, that is when they actually are going to say that we are going to invade North Korea. But on that particular point in time, they don't just say, also China is having underground nuclear weapons, but they do not go and invade it. On our counterfactual, we tend to say that we have so many things in status quo which require the national government's attention. You have things like Obamacare and also these particular kind of welfare things that are going to require your attention. When you say you are actively supporting something, that using the statistics I've shown you, a lot of funds are going to be spent on on goods and services of this particular kind of weapon production and all that, which is something we are saying is detrimental on our side of the house. We need to investigate how natural monopolies are actually imperative for the state to sustain their kind of protection and social contract theory on the side of just funding and also sustain that kind of natural security that it has already put in society.
We thank the speaker for their speech. We would now like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the speech for the side. Please do your best to be sure that you're audible. I'll give that time to set up the timer.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible. Let me set up the timer. All right, the timer is set. You can go ahead and start.
Okay. Just 1 second. Okay. And I'll start in 3, 2, 1. I think if there's one thing the OO forgets to realize in this debate is that the nuclear arms race is going to go on anyway, whether we have the military industrial complex or we don't. If the US doesn't manufacture quality weaponry and innovate like weaponry and stuff like that, North Korea is going to do it. The thing in this debate is that these countries want to look relevant in terms of their military and their economy. And if they do not do that urgently in the most effective way possible, if they wait on government to suddenly get money to fund these things and have quality weaponry, then North Korea is going to do it. They're going to lose relevance and they're probably going to lose a lot of security. We think that's particularly problematic and they fail to realize that in this debate. I'm going to do two things in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to engage the material we get from Perez's speech. Then I'm going to move to the comparative and why our world is probably better for economic and political relevance that these particular states care about. He talks about a couple of things. One, the social contract and how government ought to protect people. Two responses. One, we think government does have to protect itself. And protecting itself in status quo today looks like flexing. It looks like showing that you have the best weaponry and the best quality weaponry, because only then will countries not engage and not choose to attack. But secondly, they need to be relevant in international spaces. This looks like being relevant politically, being relevant economically, and especially having a powerful military. If we're able to prove to you that they'll do that, then they fulfill the social contract. But even if that was not true, we think we tell you very clearly the arms race is always going to go on, whether we have this or we don't. Secondly, they talk about the threat that this private sector would create towards the government and how they'll probably have a monopoly over the military. There's a very huge logical leap here, because she assumes that because we are going to produce weaponry, suddenly private sector has monopoly over violence. We think the government is still going to choose to wage war. It's still going to command people the military to move to Afghanistan and stuff like that. We don't think the private sector will suddenly have the power to do that. The only thing they're doing in our world is producing this weaponry. Government still has a monopoly over violence. Government still gets to declare who goes to wage war and stuff like that. But even if that was not true, we think private firms already have a relationship with the government. Government already creates policy and can regulate this space in terms of what do this private sector get to do? What power do they have? And most importantly, in our world, there's a bigger incentive for them to do that when we move it to the private sector. Because in your world, if you're going to say small militia groups or private companies are going to come together and probably create some industry, it's probably going to be worse in your world, because in our world, government will have an incentive to regulate this private sector at the point where it becomes a thing that's legal and a thing that's in policy. We think that's important. Secondly, they talk about how increase in research in the military is probably going to happen. One, I fail to see how this is problematic. We need to have quality weapons to look better than Russia. But secondly, we think this will probably increase money for the state, because note, countries like US depend on the military very heavily and they get tons of money from this. So if we're able to get more private companies get into this particular space, probably have competition, making sure quality is good, then we think that becomes beneficial. Then again, they talk about how government needs to focus on things like Obamacare and other issues. That's precisely what we're saying in our case. Government has better things to do. It's better in our world, where the only thing government has to do is probably subsidize the private sector, but not heavily depend on the military or heavily have to fund the military. Yes, we agree government cares about things like Obamacare. Government should be focusing on that, not the military. Now, moving on to talking about the comparative and what Western states care about and stuff like that. We think, firstly, I'll start with what Western states care about. One, we think Ali already talks to you how they care about things like the war on power. So they want to look defensive. They don't want to look vulnerable. Secondly, we think Western states care about things like their economy and how they look politically and in terms of their military. But thirdly, we think these states are selfish and they need to prove to us why then, even as they are selfish, they will not care about looking relevant and looking powerful, because that's what's important in this debate. So looking at the comparative, we think in our world, it will probably look like the only burden government might have is to subsidize this private sector or create policy to regulate this particular sector. Secondly, we think government is probably going to directly benefit from this particular space because more private companies are coming up, creating innovation in like military technology and stuff like that. We think their world is likely going to look like government building it like this industry on its own, which is probably going to be very slow because government has other priorities, like they said in their speech. But like, secondly, it's probably not going to like be as high quality as it would in the private sector, where many companies are coming up. There's huge competition, so there's a need to produce best quality guns, best quality weaponry. Moving on to what Western states care about and why they care about power. We think, one, countries do not trust each other in status quo. We think we can see that through like world wars, cold wars, and stuff like that. We think fear is the only thing that stops war. The US will not be attacked because it has powerful military and powerful weaponry. And the US would not attack Russia for the very same thing. So if we're able to prove that in our world, we're creating a world where they have a more powerful military because quality is increased very, very high, then that becomes important. We think countries like the US and the UK care about being more powerful than China. And a few reasons why they care. Because one, they'll probably look good in status quo, and that's very important to them. But secondly, they get to inherently protect themselves by like flexing their muscles. Because if they have powerful weaponry, then obviously no one is going to attack them, no one is going to intervene. So if we're able to prove in our world that we create more industry, like we allow more companies to come in because it's now become a thing in the private sector, it's very lucrative, so companies are going to want to come up, then that becomes important. Then moving on to why they care about like military relevance, economic relevance, and stuff like that. We need to note in status quo, the USA is struggling like economically, especially post-COVID. We can see this, how like Black Friday didn't get as many people. So the US needs to stop depending on like consumers buying stuff, because that's not going to help their economy. Consumers are suffering from COVID. They're not taking the same risks that they would before. If we're able to prove that there's a different way the private sector can chip into the economy by producing military weaponry, because like it's always going to be relevant. There's always going to be conflict in Congo. There's always going to be issues, and the US will always need to intervene. At the point we're able to prove that that's more lucrative, that's going to allow them to be more economically powerful, which they care about because they want to look better than China, then that becomes important. This makes them relevant in international spaces, relevant in terms of like the policy that they get to push, the sort of power that they have in these spaces, and that's important to them. That's important to their citizens, especially if you look at things like the social contract. Proud to propose.
We thank the speaker for their speech. We'll now like to invite the deputy leader of opposition to come and round up the opening half. Yeah. Please let me set up the timer. And please ensure you click the timer to start your time whenever you're ready to speak. Okay.
Okay, please confirm that I'm audible.
Diallo,
My,
are you here?
yeah.
Okay.
Okay, Chair, please confirm that I'm audible. Okay, so a minute. In case of any POI, use you can unmute and just ask a POI, and then I'll take you if I can. So with that, I start in 3, 2, 1. So panel, a major problem I have with side opening government is that one, opening government assumes that it only takes actively supporting military industrial complex for these Western countries to have quality weapons, for these Western countries to have military production of equipment and everything. But we still tell you, even without this active engagement, US still has quality weapons. UK still has US still has nuclear weapons. UK still has like quality weapons that can easily help them have like a higher threshold when it comes to war. At the end of the day, we tell you that all these things are possible possible, and it doesn't have to take them to actively support military-industrial complex to put them on a higher pedestal. The problem with them is that they didn't really engage and tell us how does this actively support look like, so that we can then interrogate how is it different from status quo. Something that lacks from them, maybe CG can analyze it better. We think that whenever you talk about active support, it means that the government is going to be like very actively engaged in terms of how military industrial complex goes about. If it's subsidizing private companies, it means that government sector, or rather the government, is going to be actively engaged in this kind of production. And even if we talk about government military production on the side of government, it means that the government is still going to produce, or is still going to put in a lot of money in terms of how this military production is produced and all this. At the end of the day, it is not necessarily about the sustainability of military sector for these Western countries, but we also have to look at the position of these countries right now as how they appear in the geopolitical spectrum. You have to understand that most of these Western countries have been like top spearheaders in terms of how we should actually be in line with how actually protecting human rights, and also how we should be ethical in terms of how we are able to conduct our militaries and everything. At the end of the day, whenever now government announces to the whole world that they are actively participating in terms of military production, and also actively participating in nuclear production, massive nuclear production of weapons, it then means that these Western countries are going to lose like their kind of hegemony that they have in terms of being top spearheaders of human rights activism and all that. Recognize that whenever we hear of countries to do a country like, for example, Russia, or whenever we hear a country like North Korea, we all know that these countries are top spearheaders in terms of perpetuating harmful acts against humans. At the end of the day, what this then means that whenever we have Western countries now actively engaging in this thing, where we have countries like Russia and North Korea have been actually actively engaging in, it then means that it puts them at a position to lose their kind of hegemony on where they stand. Perez talks to you about hypocrisy, which is not engaged from opening government. We tell you that whenever US stands to tell North Korea to stop their massive production, or their active support, or their active engagement in terms of this military industrial complex, it then means that when you take that position yourself, you're not much different from what North Korea does, you're not much different from what Russia does. This means that most people are continuously going to opt out from these Western countries, how they see them. When you look at the expansion of Russia, for example, in developing countries, Russia is continuously expanding, and when people get a reason to opt out of US, they are most likely going to opt into China or even Russia, because they feel like at least you know the devil you support rather than the angel who pretends to be good. At the end of the day, this is very detrimental for the Western countries themselves in terms of how they appear in the global spectrum, and also in terms of how they appear, for example, in international relations. We think that they are much more likely going to put themselves in a position where they're going to be linked with things to do with violation of human rights and everything. When you look at how these Western countries have really done a huge they have really put in much effort in terms of cleaning out their names. When you look at, for example, how colonialism happened, and how most of these countries have been actively engaging in paying reparations, at the end of the day, you don't want to necessarily put them in a position where they'll have to put in a lot again to clear out their names in terms of how actually they have why they engage in actively supporting a military industrial complex. Secondly, you also have to understand that whenever opening government talks necessarily about, as shifting from government production to private sector, it then means that you put the government in a position where they continuously have to be subject to private companies. At the end of the day, even when it comes to responsibility in terms of human suffrage or violation of human rights, it then means that you now put the government in a position to escape the blame. And even if it escapes the blame, whenever we have things to do with outbreak of war, the government is not going to be in a position necessarily to act, because it's the private companies who are controlling this military production, something which is not necessarily good at the end of the day. Panel, you also have to understand. why we feel like these Western countries should not actively support this military industrial complex, even if opening government talk about this kind of nuclear weapons race that already exists, we can say that yes, there is this arms race that exists, but governments, Western countries have not put themselves out there actively saying that they are actively engaging in massive production of military equipment. At the end of the day, whenever you have this kind of thing, it means that these Western countries are going to like appear aggressive. It's just going to escalate tensions and recognize the fact that countries such as North Korea, countries such as Russia are continuously looking for that trigger. So
Yeah.
as at the end of the day, you're just creating like a cycle of like tensions, conflicts, which is not something that any Western country would want. I'll take a POI from CG.
Okay, so this is the basic thing. So these people, North Korea is making so many weapons, and we can't match their energy. You're not sitting there, we are making weapons to match them, and then we finally fight them and defeat them. Don't you think we more look like heroes who are protecting people than sitting back and wait for North Korea to do whatever it wants, just like what
Okay.
Russia was doing to Ukraine?
Thank you. You see, the problem with whole government bench is that they assume that the Western countries are as they are at right now. They cannot match the capacity that North Korea has or Russia has. We tell you that panel currently, when you talk about any Western country, it means that their kind of infrastructure they've invested in, even their capacity in military, is something of top-notch quality. It then means that even without actively supporting, the government already has a leeway in terms of how they like have this kind in terms of how they like have this kind of production. At the end of the day, we tell you that the government can still match up to this kind of like North Korea or Russia, even without actively supporting. Because when you actively support, it means that the government is put on the spectrum, in the global spectrum, that the government is engaging in this military, or rather the kind of name that North Korea has right now in terms of how it produces its like weapons is the same name these Western countries are going to have in terms of how they produce their weapons. At the end of the day, this is a bad tarnishing name for the Western countries. It harms their geopolitical position and also their hegemony in terms of like how they uphold democracy, because it then means that you put whatever you believe in or whatever stance you've been taking in at a jeopardy, where your democracy or policies that you initiate within your government have to be in at par with how, for example, this production of military goes on, or you being so critical or even like paranoid to the extent that whenever North Korea is producing this, you also have to engage in massive production of that. And we think that this is just a cycle that puts this government at risk of conflict and tensions, and also opting out from most countries which actually look up to them as like countries which uphold like human rights and everything, because you have to
Victor, your
understand that
time is up.
whenever you produce something, it creates demand for war, and something that is bad.
All right, we thank that speaker for their speech. We'd now like to invite member of government to come and start the debate. So I'll try setting up the timer first, then just try to speak to be sure that you are audible before we start.
Can you hear me? Audio.
Yes, you're audible.
All right. I'm not looking. It's okay. I'm not looking at the chat space. So just unmute and like say POI, and then I'll take you. But let me say before. I'm just gonna park a bit and then like speak. Sorry. Okay. Just give me like 1 minute. Okay. Liz, hold me the timer.
We tell you, you just do one. We don't tell you.
I'm gonna start in 3, 2, 1. So Fernando, I think the couple of things that like I ought to clarify from like side OO. That is to say, I don't think necessarily how they say the things in their case, that's how things specifically work. That is to say, Western democracies are like more developed democracies. They're not democracies which specifically look at like they're not democracies which specifically look at like so basically they've already provided better services. For example, when you go to America or you go to like the UK, they already give services to people. So things like service delivery and like primary services, for example, health, are things that they already have and they already actively do. Why is this important? I think it necessarily like disproves what you get from OO, because OO says, hey, you have other specific things to care about. I don't because Western democracy is already developed and they have solved a majority of their specific problems. That is to say, service delivery still exists, even when they like heavily prioritize other specific things. But I think what I'm going to do for CG is show you a specific incentive for these Western democracies. I think OG do a good job by like showing why you care about geopolitics and why you ought to be strong and stuff like that. But I think the major incentive as to why countries actually provide services or countries actually even care about their military is their specific citizens. That is to say, the USA buffs its military because it cares about its citizens. The UK buffs its military because it cares about its citizens. You get similar to Russia, similar to North Korea. That's why they buff up because they care about their citizens, protecting them and in terms of bettering them. The incentive we're specifically going to look at from side CG is the incentive of how you better individuals and why you actively supporting like this military complex is beneficial for your citizens. Why? Because I think specific democracies like America care a lot about like what their citizens think. That is why even when they carry out specific policies, for example, when there was an abortion thing in America, everyone made noise and like things were about to become like so wrong. You get. So I think necessarily what I'm going to do is show you why that specific incentive is something that we care about. You get? So now let me start. One, we think why is this specific incentive important? That is to say, we think actively supporting. Actively supporting necessarily looks like providing subsidies, heavily financing the military and all those specific stuff. But we think all missed the debate by saying, hey, private sectors are going to have a lot of power. Why? That's not true. Western democracies have stronger governments who have the ability to hold private sectors accountable. We think that's something that is important. But more importantly, and this is based on optics, why you make your citizens more happy by actively investing into the military. How does this look like? One, we think at a point in time where Western democracies actively involve or do the military complex, we think it expands the military sector. Why is this important? That is to say, you have more individuals being enlisted into armies to use those specific weapons. That is to say, most of the armies of the United States are filled with minorities. We think we then create a larger gap when we actively invest in the complex military industry because we expand it. And the idea of expanding it, that you create more job employment opportunities. That is to say, this goes two ways. Not only for the individuals who are necessarily there to do research, but we think even for the specific individuals who end up fighting in those specific wars. Why is this important? Overall, citizens now become more happy because they now have the capability to present their countries because there's been an expansion in the specific military that they work in. But more importantly, even in terms of research, that is to say, more researchers are got. Those are all employment opportunities because you're actively investing into the complex military industry and you're broadening it. We think that is a far better incentive. That is far better because we think that when wars happen, citizens are the ones who suffer because they get killed. At a point where you make those specific citizens happy because they're the ones who contribute to all the finances that go into developing this military stuff, we think it's extremely better. I'll ask OO for a POI if they have. 3, 2, 1.
Your IGs. So
All
you
right.
say that the Western liberal democracies have a kind of strong government that they're able to keep like these private sectors in check. How are you going to keep them in check when you're surrendering one of like your protect agencies to them.
Abigail, in the United States, power is generated by private industries, but the American government still has the capability to maintain them. Why? They are less corrupt. They have the resources to ensure that the policies they make are true. You just can't come and say this is not a developing context we're talking about. We're talking about Western democracies. They are more organized. They have policies to protect their specific citizens. So you can't just come and make the assertion that they are not. But even if I take you at your best, the idea is that the US government has the specific resources. The US government will have the incentive to cap them because the private industry is getting out of hand. But more important than I think the last extension, understand, we think actively developing or putting like money in like this military complex thing also holds the ability for you to come up with more defensive mechanisms. Why is that? Whenever things like nuclear weapons happen and stuff like that, individuals are killed. So individuals are actively being hurt in the line of duty. Why does this actively supporting become extremely important? That is to say, you gain more research into protecting people against advanced weapons. Even at a point in time where you don't build many nuclear weapons, you have the capability to devise technology to benefit and protect your citizens from specific attacks. Look at what happened when Palestine was attacking Israel, and how Israel like easily fended off all those missiles. That is what happens when you actively develop or actively invest in like the military complex. You have the capability not only to develop yourself, but also ensure that you get better defensive mechanisms against more advanced weapons. Why is that important? At a point in time where you only concentrate on your offensive, your defense becomes bad. This helps countries increase their defensive. That is to say, like or say America already has a good weaponry, but America also can't defend its specific citizens because they don't have that specific research. Actively doing this helps you come up with more defensive mechanisms to protect your specific citizens. What I provided you was a basic case. I showed to you why the incentive of making citizens is more important than the geopolitical thing that OG gives you. Henry will weigh it up. But overall, understand when you make your citizens happy, it is better. Actively supporting this makes our citizens better. Yeah, see.
The speaker for their speech should not let invite a member of government to give their speech. With mic test so I can be short, like short, audible, and go ahead.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible. Let me set up your timer very quickly.
POI, your voice. With that being said, starting my speech in three, two, one. The excessive support leads to such a thin line that the civilians have to tread carefully or they fall to the power of the corrupt people that gets too much power and support from the state that should protect the people. So a few nuances then that has been missed by all sides of the house. What is the difference between actively supporting and just supportive? What this motion calls for is the active support of the military industrial complex, which means that the country will funnel the majority of the funds. They will also back the actions of the military in all of its entirety insofar as the government and the military has been sewn together. Therefore, the harms done by the military will then have the safety net of the government having their backs, right? So if you actively support the military complex of the country, it will greatly impact how the people will think of the certain political propaganda and say that the military is the end all be all of the politics, right? It will mean that it will fester unnecessary fear among its people. So if we don't actively support it, since we don't have to necessarily oppose its entire existence, we tell you that that they just get enough support to train high level soldiers without getting the influence that will throw off the balance. This is a major delineation from OO, right? Because we actually concede to the fact that we need to fund the civil defense. So our world then looks like first paying soldiers adequate wage that doesn't really have to be over the top, and second not over romanticizing the military to the point where they get better social incentives like free food from establishments and all of that, right? So what is the best interest of the western world anyway then, right? It is to be seen as the beacon of innovation and be the center of trade, which you can't achieve if you perpetuate the narrative that you are preparing for a war to such extent, right? So this analysis is very important as it considers the political standing of the Western world because certain countries like China are being villainized for being too aggressive with their stance, that their stance as a hegemony is being put into scrutiny, right? So we tell you then that war is unlikely to happen. Therefore, the urgency is not that big because all countries can grasp the magnitude of what will happen if World War III breaks out. Note, panel, that we are more globally connected now than we have ever been, and we know the risk of what will happen if we put peace at risk. And even if in the worst case where North Korea starts making conflict, the impacts are comparatively low that they won't opt into it because it is them against the world, which then they won't win. In principle, then, it is bad because the Western countries are not the vulnerable actors, right? They are not the one being invaded, but rather they are the ones pillaging and aggravating the other countries. Therefore, if we show active support in the industrialization, it is bad insofar as it perpetuates the stereotype that the Western countries are still out to get the developing countries, which will then be bad because it will be bad to get partnerships considering that large countries like China are constantly putting fear in the developing countries, making partnerships hard to achieve, right? So we tell you that actively supporting the military industrialization will wound them politically insofar as these impacts will manifest. First, the Western world will just maintain this aggressive stance against the world, which is bad since their reputation in the global landscape greatly impacts their relationships with countries that gives them advantages. And second, it will make people opt into fear mongering and want to lash out on other countries, furthering the military mindset where the people think that war is the best course of action, especially in a post-Cold War state, right? So the problem with the whole Gov case then is plain and simple. They posit to us three things, right? First, the US makes a lot of money selling ammunition. Second, they have the incentive to have a military that has experience in working defense. And third, it makes them stay relevant with the political landscape. And even if we can see that the US gets incentives from giving ammunition to other countries, they will also be the central target of other countries, especially since the US is at the front row of giving sanctions. We tell you then that their whole case fails in four levels of rebuttals, right? The weapons don't just make themselves panel. We tell you that what OG claims is a quick cash grab as the US provides ammunition to other countries, but we tell you that all of that is at the expense of the taxpayer money. Therefore, they can just say that this industrial militarization is good since their incentives are not exclusive on their side. And second, they posit that economically wise, it is good for the US insofar as they get trade from selling guns. But we tell you that if you actively try to sustain fighter jets and nuclear bombs, you only funnel funds out into the ocean insofar as the likelihood of a large scale war is comparatively low because it won't benefit any of the Western powers. Third, sure, they have the incentive to actually have manpower that knows what they're doing. It's still a basic line of defense that doesn't necessarily have to be absent on our side. And lastly, the U.S. is already relevant internationally. It is being seen as as majorly as a peacekeeper by the majority of the countries, despite it having sketchy undertones. At least on our side, it doesn't villainize it further, right? So in CG, then they tell us two things, right? First, they tell us that the Western world buffs out the military because they apparently care about their citizens. And second, they claim that they get better civil obedience insofar as they get citizens to support the government. And we tell you that this analysis is wrong in these levels. First, the majority of the U.S. does with their military is done not out of the care for the citizens, right, but rather to assert their dominance. This is seen when they enacted the Cold War and how they invaded Vietnam. Second, they claim that they get better social incentives when they support the military, and I think that the government lives too much in a perfect world, right? Because there are instances where the military is what oppresses their citizens. And lastly, they claim that they get better defensive mechanisms when the mechanisms are only engaging if the state supports the military, right? But they have to engage in what happens if they actively put into work on not just defense but attack. So soft lining, right? So in CO, then we will prove why Western countries already have the advantage of a stable economy and active military, and why the
Yeah.
active militarization will trigger the tension between the global north and it's bad for the international relations, right? So for my first argument then, why does this actually harms the country insofar as it is taking the majority of the influence, right? We tell you that it is harmful since it only caters to the three main branches of the industrialization, right? The military, business, and the politicians, right? So it will only cater to the business owners because they will have the incentive to make profit off of the tension, which means then that when all hell breaks loose, they can still sell ammunition and bombs to other countries. Therefore, it will still benefit them at the end of the day,
You're
but it
right.
doesn't necessarily benefit the citizens on the ground, right? Second, it will only immediately cater to the military because they get the majority of the funds and and the support of the government, right? They
You're
would
right.
want to employ because they get better incentives when they are needed, right? So even if there was no war happening, if they can build enough state paranoia and anxiety, they will get better incentives to actually make the people up into following them, right? And furthermore, it is better for the politicians individually since they will get the active support of the military. Therefore, their seat will already be set, right? So the flow of the advantage will then just be encircled within these three actors, right? But who suffers then? The people on the ground. They are the one who suffers insofar as the impacts will happen, right? The militarily will have too much influence on the people, therefore they will most likely get away with discriminating people because they will have the power of the government to back them up, and the Western world will then risk the support of the people, and there might be an uprising to throw off the militarization. The point is, if you give the military too much power, people will fear disenfranchisement, therefore they will be more incentivized to stop it even before it starts. This is bad since the Western countries need to have this reputation to be so for democracy, therefore the coup will be bad for them and their reputations. Furthermore, it is bad because it will increase the tension between the countries because they don't want to be behind on the defense. It means that if the US actively supports its military, the rest of the Western world will soon follow suit. And it makes the global international politics a short tank to navigate. In our side panel, we don't risk aggravating our people and our allies by being over the top for a war that no one wants to happen. And that is why we oppose. Thank you.
We thank the speaker for their speech. We'd now like to invite government whip to come and handle the debate for their side of the house. Here. I'll set up the timer right now, so you can use that time to test if you're audible. So we can run this as fast as possible.
Okay, so I want to confirm if I am like audible.
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, cool. Since I'm audible, let me try to get the motion up. Where is the motion? Remember. Okay, motion's up. Oof. Okay, so if you have any POI, and for the record, I am not taking closing opposition because they did not take any of, like, they did not accept any closing POI, and they have a whole opposition whip speech to engage CG. So I hope you understand, Chair, when I say I'm not taking POIs from closing. I'll lovely, most lovely, like want to take, like, POIs from opening because this one's gonna be interesting. Okay, so if I gender pronounce anything male, I'll start in 3, 2, 1, go. Chair, this is very important. This is an actor motion. So James comes and characterizes to you the type of actor we have, the type of actor, what their interests are, and what they most probably stand for. This means two things. One, this is the first thing that closing government does that opening does. Opening government does not do. First reason why we are more relevant than our opening government. But on direct engagement, all opposition benches don't show you why US, why UK, France, Italy should go against their interests, what they want to make people safer, to promote their image, to make people more pleasant to them, to protect their citizens. Go against that and then take whatever opening opposition is telling them and ignore all their harms. The problem with this debate, the issue with this debate, that you don't just come and give harms and benefits. No, you really have to go at the extra hand to go and show how those harms are bad to the actor in itself, because they come and talk about very many harms to individuals and whatnot. You don't show why the state should care about those individuals. Much as, yes, we know and the conditions that state should, it's about state caring about for individuals. Government sides are the only sides that mechanize to you how everything we do, sort of even caring for people, is something government would actually care about. Opening opposition and closing does not do that whatsoever. Actually, closing does not do it at all. We think on that age alone, strategically, we win from closing government. But then most importantly, we go on further to give you like analysis. We talk about the most in the, like, the general aspect of everything, why society is generally like very much one that why governments have a big obligation to the people, and that's what James like sort of runs on extension. But let me first like engage this like opposition and like Jesus. I'm going to do three things. I'm going to engage opposition side, then I'm going to engage opposition side, And on top of engaging opposition side, what I'm going to do, I'm going to engage all opposition sides. On top of engaging all opposition sides, I'm going to like show you why James's extension is the best extension in the round. Sorry, I was like gotten a bit distracted. Understand one simple thing, Chan. This is like very important. Opening up opposition does not show you why all the harms that happen are those that the actor should care about. Much of the fact that we prove we need more ammunition. But let me first give you a bit of some like context and characterization to first knock out all benches before I even deep into the matter. When evolution of weaponry, when you have guns and one person has a knife, the people with the guns will always oppress the person with the knife. But then the person with a knife needs a person with a gun to protect them so that the people with that gun does not bully them. Who are the people with the guns? The autocratic countries that sort of use brutal force to attack people. Democracy is the norm and you have to protect rights of people. But the countries that have protect the rights of people only have knives. Because when you say that we should not actively invest, yet China, yet North Korea are actively investing and bombing the Atlantic Ocean, sort of like putting missiles into the sea, causing a lot of climate change. The only reason why we can't, like, you really need to match their energies because they won't get scared because right now they're testing weapons stronger than what the US has to offer. For crying out loud, even the UN had to like put like question the Russia on using semi-automated weapons not to fight Ukraine because Ukraine is defenseless. We think countries that are in the West need to have this sort of weaponry, and that is why Ukraine is trying to like have fend off Russia because they have support from US countries. Let's imagine these people did not actively invest in their weaponry and Russia did. We think US will still not have enough weaponry to give Ukraine to match the energy Russia did have. But comparatively in our world, if we would have done and if we're doing active support, we'd have enough weaponry to match the energy of these people. So the issue with evolution of weaponry is that when your enemy or when your rival develops a bigger weapon, it's also you need to develop a weapon to match them. It's not just about flexing muscles and cause fear, like what opening government throws to you. We go deeper in nuances and show you that these people are actually going to come and threaten minority groups because people don't have enough weaponry to match their energy. That becomes important because US focuses on not just the people but defending minority groups because very many conservative countries won't do that in the first place. We think on that clash we win because we show you that at the end of the day it is very much necessary and we prove more on that more analytically than our opening. But then we knock out opening, like closing with that. Let's move on in like as we go on in the speech. Understand something very important. What does like closing tell you? All closing tells you we need to be defensive. Well, we don't need to be actively putting in the work. I think James already shows you this far that to be on the defensive, you need to have equally strong weaponry. We don't think that Israel would have fended off those missiles if they weren't so busy sort of matching the energy that Palestine was having. We think when you just do investment, it's not enough. And this is why we need these private people into play. Because private people go down into the institutions and get very good scientists, very talented scientists, because they have enough money and that is their main goal. And that's where their focus is. So they have enough money and resources to make these people pay them. So they have the very best scientists. So we need to actually give them the weapons and give them power to monitor the weapons. OG comes and tells you about the idea of how these people want lose control. We tell you on our end that the idea is that if we don't have that, the only reason why we want to have these people on our side is because people like Al Qaeda, people like Boko Haram are going to invest these people. The issue is that if you don't actually actively invest, you won't get to have the luxury to put these people in a contract because these people only go to the highest bidder. But the problem is that if Boko Haram has a bigger deal than yours, they'll obviously go to Boko Haram. But if you have a bigger deal that is leading to actively investing, you're subsidizing them, the obligation is more to you and their contracts are more to you. That's the logic between these things. I think that particular point enough shows you where we need to have these people on our side and actively invest. These are things that OJ doesn't tell you, are things that knock out all opposition benches at all. On that clash, we also win. Let's understand something else also. Incentive to have manpower. We don't think manpower is enough to win the war. And I've already proven that that's fine in the speech. We proved to you why that is particularly important. Now let me use this 1 minute to dissect opening opposition. Opening opposition comes and tells you, oh yeah, I notice the fact that there is no engagement from opening. Okay, let me just, if there's a POI from opening opposition, please give it because like 15 seconds are running out. 3, 2, 1. Chair, really notice the lack of engagement from any of these benches. Let me move on from opening opposition. Opening opposition comes and tells you in the first their speech, these people are going to be hypocritic. You see, the harms are going to still happen, even though you don't do these things. But the problem is if you don't have the ammunition, you won't be able to fend off these people. However, if you have the ammunition to actually fight against these people, we are more seen as heroes because we fight these individuals and fight for our citizens. James already gives you point on analysis as to why these people we need to have them, how we save more lives in our world. Because the current status quo is that these people don't have enough ammunition. They send men to go and fight for their country. They force people 18-year-olds to go and get guns to fight for their country because they don't have enough ammunition and are not investing into this weaponry. Mothers are left dying. This is what it looks like, panel. Mothers are left dying because their husbands have to go to war and die there and be left to burden and like deal with their children. Instead of actually not giving so much incentive to care about them when their husbands die. Comparatively, if we actually actively invest, we get also some autonomous weapons that Russia has, and we can match their energy and we won't have to have more people dying. Things James runs to you. Comparatively, then we are not being hypocritical, but actually saving the people. Also, that knocks out also all of like DLO's argumentation. Western countries, we think Russia grows, and we also need to grow with them. Yes, we have the quality, but we need quality enough to match their energy. What have I proven to you from my whip speech? I've proven to you that there are necessity for us to have this weaponry and the massive benefit, and as to why it best benefits US, and US is in a greater position to have them because they serve individuals, they promote their image, and they do these things. We do better mechanization, we deal with the more holistic part of the debate and the argumentation. We are so much better than OG, we are so much better than all the opposition benches. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their speech. We would now like to invite opposition whip to come and round up the debate. Let me set up the timer so you can use that time to question.
Hi, so I'll be using my teammate's device instead because I'm having technical issues with my own device. But anyway, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. When your opponents have guns and you have guns too, but yours is continuously threatened by the internal political pressures by other actors who want to wield the guns themselves, we say you're better off asserting dominance without sacrificing your own interests. Otherwise, you lose the internal battle and you lose the international one. CO recognizes that the harms of having a strong military is value neutral, but we say that by actively supporting it, the extent by which such harms manifest are disproportionately high to the extent that it's not worth actively supporting. But a quick clarification, right? In both paradigms, the value of the military will remain. Western countries can't just automatically ignore their military in opposition. The extent that they do, however, is the one in question. And we even argue is better not only for the military standing of the country, but to its overall impact to Western countries, right? Realize, secondly, that not actively supporting it does not mean regressing to spears and knives. It just means we reject the speed and extent by which it pushes the sometimes benefits you get in government. The problem with having this complex is the fragile nature by which a relationship operates. The fact that a single conflict of interest between the stakeholders involved can warrant the act of full-scale war is enough reason to not actively support its continuous rise to power and threat, insofar as it goes against the very goal of Western countries to remain stable and to have a clean international reputation. For these reasons, we say opposed. Two issues then. Firstly, on where Western countries are internally better off, right? OG talks about how it's going to be immoral to use funds for military through taxpayer money. And then secondly, there's going to be economic benefits, right? Osichi talks about the notion of corporate accountability and how it's going to be good for your people. I have two responses for this, right? Firstly, a very quick call out on the principle from OG. Realize that it's not immoral insofar as the military is protecting the taxpayers in the first place. Whether or not the complex itself, the government is still going to do this. But secondly, it becomes immoral because of the excess and the extent by which the complex spends money at the expense of other more urgent needs like better education, universal healthcare, and addressing the issue of climate change. Sure, even if the government doesn't have to worry about these things as much, we argue that the narratives contradict that insofar as people on the ground become unlikely to vote politicians into power when their main platform isn't related to the complex. It's going to be unsustainable in the long run then, insofar as its implications are not limited to war conversations only, even outside of it. But secondly, government paints companies in the best way possible by talking about sustainability and the nature of competition. we say firstly that it's only going to be the case when companies are small and can be controlled by the government by government regulations, right? This is not the case in this complex. More so when they're actively supported, where their importance is highlighted, which means that they know they're needed, so they're likely to get away with crossing a few lines until they cross the biggest line that shouldn't have been crossed anyway, i.e., actively pursuing the notion of war. This proportional increase in the strength of the private companies and the nature of the commodity that they sell makes them dangerous. Then we don't want that coming from CO. But CG claims the notion of accountability. But we tell it is it becomes harder to attain at the point in which their hands are tied because of the private sector's higher influence. Like at the point in which they choose to lower defense spending, corporations are likely to get away with starting public clamor about how the government doesn't care about the people enough to defend them after the continuous strengthening of the complex. We don't want that internal instability to happen coming from CO. But even if the people are going to feel safe, right, because of this, we tell you this is actually going to be unlikely to happen when current narratives are even against the increased militarization, especially among the young people, right? It's not going to be even argued that the opposite is true. You're going to feel more unsafe because of the normalization of notions that prioritize the military as opposed to other things. Like take for example the imposition of the premium and being a soldier, for example, and being a person in STEM, for example, which is part of the trickle down effects that you get in government, right? This means that it's actually contrary to the interests of Western countries who want to promote variety as much as possible. But realize secondly that this is still value neutral. You will still have companies producing weapons in opposition, but they'll have better incentives to ensure quality because they can't hold as much influence in governments as they do in like side government. But even if it actually benefits the economy, we see that Western countries' primary source of GDP is not the sale of ammunition anyway, but other sectors that are more sustainable. This means that even if they will take a hit, it's not to the extent that it ultimately harms them. But on the second issue, right, where they're better off internationally, OG and even CG, like they just attack them as a whole. They talk about two things: that it's going to be sustainable for the military system, that market systems are efficient anyway. I have like two levels of analysis as to why we win this clash. But before I proceed, sure, POI.
So to that
POI.
extent, it's not about the image, it's about catching up with these other actors. So you see a flying jet, the question
Okay,
is,
okay. Okay,
also
I'm going to answer that in my levels of analysis. Firstly, we question the premise of narrowing this debate down to sustaining the military system, right? Because firstly, it makes it seem like it's a tipping point of the interests of Western countries. Obviously, that is not true because they have other equally important interests like sustaining their economy and their liberal democracy facade. That's for the essence of democracy in other Eastern countries, right? So even if it's the case, where do you sustain the military system better? Notice that this benefit is value neutral. Whether or not it's actively supported, Western countries will still spend for such. But Sandy secondly gave you three levels of stakeholder analysis as to prove why the continuous growth of the military industrial complex is going to do more harm than good insofar as it concentrates the power on these major actors whose interests are bound to collide. Like for example, how private companies want war to happen because it gives them more profit, which is contrary to the interests of the state. But even if it does happen in government, right, in their best case, it's going to be unsustainable because of different interests. But also we argue that it's bound to aggravate existing issues, right? But secondly, the weighing here is uncertainty. The use of the materials you get from the complex is contingent on having war in the first place. This means that on weighing of certainty, you sustain your military better when you don't overspend more than what you can handle and more than what you're likely to use. OG pushes a false dichotomy: either you depend on private sector for military or you stand on your own. Obviously this is untrue because the nature of the complex is that of codependence. They get something in exchange for something, or as actors want to have incentives to say, why is this better in opposition? Going to get better sustenance because you ensure that what you have now is maintained properly, which is unlikely to happen when you're too focused on the next new shiny thing that might not even work. But suddenly you realize that literally, if you do discover something new, you can be more sustainable by selling less productive military equipment as opposed to hogging them at the expense of other priorities. But thirdly, you realize that in terms of the optics, you're less likely to call out low quality and failures in the weapon construction when it is actively supported, insofar as that failure also reflects your own failure as the government. You don't want that to be publicized, or you harm your own interests. But secondly, right, in our worst case that another country attacks us, I have two responses for this. Firstly, Sandy already told you that we'll still have sufficient resources to defend ourselves or even launch a counterattack to send a message on why war is likely to happen in the first place, right? Because literally China isn't even going to attack you when you're part of their largest trading partners, right? We're not in the 1950s. But even if that is true, we say that Western countries have defense alliances anyway, like NATO and the individual relationships the countries have through mutual defense treaties, like with US and Korea and Australia and the like. This not only proves that going against such Western countries isn't unlikely because of their already established military, but there's also going to have this backup plan, right? But this also proves that when it does happen, they can do so self-defend themselves. But even if the quality of defense is still going to be less, we say that's a trade-off that we're actually willing to make in CO, right? Because number one, Western countries are the ones who started anyway, so the harm to the country itself is small. But secondly, it's absolutely unlikely to happen anyway because of the very important context that all other houses fail to improve, which is that of the high global integration. But ultimately, the most important weighing mechanism here is that on irreversibility. in government, the likelihood of reversing the harms that will inevitably happen becomes low because the self-correcting mechanisms that you have when you're better able to balance the power dynamics between the actors involved also becomes lower with the rising strength of the complex. In opposition, the worst case and unlikely harms of failing to stay at par with other countries are easily reversed by expediting current processes or by consulting with current defense partners. So ultimately, you're better in CO. But why are we actually better than OO, right? Two things. We talked about its internal and external implications better and how it actually works. And secondly, we also talked about how it's going to be harmful even outside of the militaristic conversations, but also in the way it trickles down to other vulnerable actors like the citizens on the ground, which we tell you on scale is actually but greater, right? So the net harm is greater than government's net benefits. So for all those reasons, we say oppose. Thank you.
Okay, we have now come to the end of this round. I would be taking a few minutes to check through my notes and decide to stay in the room or like just go out of the room if you want to. But this should be very fast. Yeah.